The Callaway bloodline, a secret guarded by the mountains. In the deep hollows of eastern Kentucky, where frigid, dark mountains hold on to their secrets and time creeps like molasses, a bloodline exists that defies all common knowledge regarding human survival. For over a century, the Callaway family lived by rules that civilized society had long cast aside. These were laws not penned in courthouses but etched into the very DNA of the family. These laws would ultimately result in the most genetically isolated family line ever recorded in Kentucky's documented history. The gravel road that spirals up Troublesome Creek bears no markers, nor does it have signs to warn travelers of what they might find at its terminus. Local sheriffs have always preferred this. Yet, in 2019, when the camera of a documentary filmmaker finally pierced their mountain fortress, it brought to light a story that had been murmured in church pews and around courthouse squares for generations. This is a story of what happens when a family tree ceases to branch outward and instead starts to strangle itself, creating something that medical science insists cannot exist, yet somehow does. Hello everyone. Before we proceed, make sure you like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with your location and the time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep offering you stories precisely like this one. What you're about to hear is not mountain folklore or an Appalachian legend. It is a documented reality, captured on film, validated by geneticists, and buried within medical files that most people were never intended to see. This is the account of how 4 generations of continuous cousin marriages created the most inbred family in Kentucky's recorded history, and how they survived hidden in plain sight, in a state that had simply forgotten their existence. The Callaway family represents more than a genetic catastrophe. They embody the dark mathematics of isolation, the relentless arithmetic of what occurs when bloodlines turn inward upon themselves for close to a century. Their harrowing story begins in the 1890s, a time when Kentucky was still wild enough for families to disappear into the mountains and adhere to their own harsh, savage logic. The origin of a genetic nightmare. The genetic nightmare that would become the Callaway legacy began with a single choice made in 1892, when Jeremiah Callaway first settled in the remote hollows of eastern Kentucky. Unlike other pioneer families who scattered across the frontier looking for new opportunities, Jeremiah had a different plan. A plan that would trap his bloodline in these mountains for the next 130 years. Jeremiah came to Kentucky during the coal boom, when men vanished into the earth for grueling 12-hour shifts and families carved their homesteads from mountainsides that had never known civilization. But while other settlers maintained their ties to the outside world, trading with adjacent counties, marrying into distant families, and sending children to town schools, Jeremiah Callaway made a deliberate decision to sever all connection with the genetic mainstream. The mathematical basis of the Callaway genetic disaster was established in those early years. When Jeremiah's children reached maturity in the 1910s, he arranged marriages within his own steadily growing clan instead of seeking spouses from other settlements or valleys. His sons married their first cousins. His daughters wed their uncles. What started as a pragmatic choice in a remote region evolved into a systematic pattern that would define the family for generations. The brutal arithmetic of consanguinity. By the 1920s, signs of genetic damage were already noticeable, though local mountain doctors lacked the knowledge to understand what they were observing. Children born to the second generation of Callaway cousin marriages exhibited developmental delays that could not be explained by mere malnutrition or lack of schooling. Physical abnormalities appeared, marking them as distinct from other mountain families, even in a region where life's hardship was standard. However, the very isolation that created these issues also served to conceal them. The Callaway homestead was located at the end of a wagon trail that meandered for 15 miles through terrain so rugged that visitors were rare and official oversight was non-existent. County records from that time display gaps where Callaway births and deaths should have been recorded, suggesting a family that existed entirely outside the normal mechanisms of government surveillance. What makes the Callaway case singular in Kentucky's history is not merely the duration of their inbreeding experiment. It is the systematic nature of their genetic isolation. This was not the accidental outcome of a small populace making do with limited options. This was a deliberate strategy, enforced by family patriarchs across multiple generations, creating a closed genetic system that functioned like a biological laboratory experiment that no ethical committee would ever have approved. The very mountains that had promised the Calloways freedom had become their genetic prison. The cost of genetic destruction. To grasp the biological catastrophe that enveloped the Callaway family, one must understand the relentless mathematics of consanguineous reproduction. Every human carries roughly 25,000 genes. Hidden within this genetic code, we all harbor what scientists term lethal recessives, genetic mutations that remain inactive as long as we reproduce with genetically diverse partners. When first cousins mate, they share, on average, 12% of their DNA. Their children face a 25% probability of inheriting 2 copies of any recessive gene, including the lethal ones. The Calloways were not simply rolling these genetic dice once or twice. They were playing this game of biological Russian roulette systematically, generation after generation, for over a century. By the 3rd generation of Callaway inbreeding, family members were sharing well over the typical cousin percentage of DNA, upwards of 37%. By the 4th generation, some siblings were genetically more similar to each other than identical twins are to normal siblings. They had achieved a level of genetic homozygosity that computer models suggested should be entirely incompatible with human survival. Dr. Robert Harrison, a population geneticist at the University of Kentucky who studied isolated Appalachian bloodlines in the 1970s, described the Callaway genetic profile as an impossibility that somehow managed to become real. The concentration of identical gene pairs found throughout the family exceeded what mathematical models predicted could sustain human life. Yet, they not only survived, they continued to reproduce. Visible and invisible damage. The visible consequences were devastating. They included severe intellectual disabilities that left some family members capable of communicating only through grunts and gestures, as well as physical deformities, such as club feet, shortened limbs, and facial abnormalities. These deformities were so distinctive that locals could identify a Callaway from a considerable distance. But the invisible damage was even more severe. Genetic time bombs that would not detonate until adulthood, congenital heart defects that guaranteed shortened lifespans, immune system failures that rendered common infections potentially fatal, and neurological disorders causing progressive seizures, uncontrollable tremors, and gradual mental deterioration. The Callaway family tree had become a complete catalog of every genetic disaster that could befall the human species. Perhaps most troubling to the geneticists who later studied the family was the fact that the reproductive pattern persisted despite increasingly obvious consequences. Each succeeding generation brought more severe disabilities and more visible genetic damage. Yet, the family patriarch continued to arrange cousin marriages, as if the mounting proof of biological catastrophe was entirely unseen. The mountains that sheltered the Calloways had become a laboratory for genetic destruction, and the experiment was far from finished. A shadow world exposed. For 70 years, the Callaway family existed in a shadow world that the rest of Kentucky chose to ignore. While the state modernized around them, constructing highways, establishing universities, joining the 20th century, the Calloways remained frozen in a time capsule of their own making, governed by rules belonging to a prior era entirely. Local authorities were naturally aware of their existence. Social workers had filed reports as early as the 1940s, documenting children who couldn't attend school, adults who couldn't maintain employment, and a family structure that defied every norm of American society. But in eastern Kentucky, where government interference was viewed with the same skepticism as promises from coal companies, the Calloways were permitted to manage their own affairs. The conspiracy of silence that protected them was not born of malice. It arose from a mountain culture that understood some families carried burdens too heavy for outsiders to fully grasp. The Calloways were known throughout Breathitt County as that clan up Troublesome Creek, discussed in hushed conversations at church socials and never mentioned in polite company. But this cultural protection exacted a terrible cost. Cut off from medical intervention, educational opportunities, and social services, the family developed its own internal logic for survival in a world that had no place for them. They created a subsistence economy that had barely evolved since the Civil War, growing their own food, sewing their own clothes, and, most critically, creating their own rules regarding marriage and genetic destiny. An ecosystem of mutual care. By the 1960s, the genetic damage had become impossible for even isolated mountain communities to overlook. Callaway family members were dying in their 20s and 30s from medical complications that local doctors had never encountered. Children were being born with disabilities so severe they required constant supervision. Yet, somehow, the family endured, passing down not only their genes but their unique way of life to each new generation. What outsiders failed to understand was that the Callaways had evolved beyond merely being victims of their genetics. They had become specialists in survival under impossible conditions, in a world that would have either institutionalized them or simply dismissed them as evolutionary failures. They had forged their own ecosystem of mutual care and protection. Family members who retained some cognitive function became caretakers for those who did not. Those who could still communicate with outsiders became interpreters for those who had lost even basic speech capabilities. Their genetic curse had become their identity. Their disability had transformed into their strength. The end of isolation. But this hidden existence could not last indefinitely. The modern world possesses a knack for uncovering even the most meticulously concealed secrets. The year 2019 marked the end of the Callaway family's century-long isolation. Documentary filmmaker Marcus Webb was driving the back roads of eastern Kentucky, seeking untold stories of Appalachian poverty, when he took an incorrect turn down an unmarked gravel road. What he found at the end of that road would haunt him for the rest of his life and expose one of Kentucky's deepest secrets to the world. The scene that greeted Webb defied easy comprehension. Here, in the 21st century, was a family that existed outside of time itself. Thomas Callaway, the family patriarch, could barely form coherent words, communicating mainly through grunts and primitive gestures that his relatives somehow understood. His sister Mary had slightly better verbal skills, but her speech was slurred and childlike, despite her being nearly 40 years old. Their cousin brother Jimmy sat rocking on the porch, his eyes unfocused, making sounds that resembled no human language. The living conditions were medieval. With no running water, they drew water from a contaminated creek. Without electricity, they lived by candlelight and wood fires. With no plumbing, human waste was managed in ways that belonged to the 19th century. But these physical hardships were not the most disturbing aspect of Webb's discovery. It was the realization that this family represented 4 generations of systematic genetic destruction. If you're still watching, you are already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what you would have done if this had been your bloodline. Bureaucratic blind spot. As Webb spent more time with the family, the full scope of institutional failure became clear. Social services had been aware of the Callaways for decades, sending checks but never addressing the underlying causes. Medical professionals had treated their emergency conditions but never questioned why an entire bloodline required constant intervention. Educational officials had simply dismissed them as unreachable, making no effort to break the cycle of ignorance that perpetuated their genetic isolation. The family had become Kentucky's invisible tragedy, existing in a bureaucratic blind spot where their constitutional right to reproduce freely conflicted with the obvious necessity for intervention. Local authorities had made a calculated decision: it was easier to simply look the other way than to confront the complex moral and practical challenges the Callaways represented. When Webb's documentary was broadcast on national television, it ignited a firestorm of controversy that forced Kentucky to face an uncomfortable truth. In the heart of America, an entire family had been abandoned to genetic destiny for over a century, surviving through sheer biological stubbornness while society pretended they did not exist. The exposure of the Callaway family created a national crisis of conscience that Kentucky was not equipped to handle. A living laboratory. Within months of Webb's documentary airing, the family found themselves at the center of a media circus that treated them alternately as objects of scientific fascination and human tragedy. The privacy that had sheltered them for over a century was suddenly stripped away, exposing them to a world that shifted between morbid curiosity and genuine horror. Geneticists descended on the family like researchers discovering a new species. Here was a living laboratory of extreme inbreeding that provided data no ethical study could ever generate. DNA analysis revealed levels of genetic similarity that challenged existing scientific models of human viability. The Callaways were walking proof that the human genome could endure far more damage than previously documented, but at a cost so terrible that it redefined the medical understanding of genetic limits. Medical examinations uncovered conditions that existed primarily in textbooks and research papers. Rare genetic disorders typically appearing only in isolated populations were concentrated in a single Kentucky bloodline. The family had become a living catalog of recessive genetic diseases, each member carrying combinations of mutations that should have been mathematically impossible. The price of negligence. But the most condemning aspect of the modern discovery was not scientific. It was institutional. The investigation showed that the Callaway family had been receiving various forms of government assistance for decades. Yet, no official had ever questioned why an entire bloodline required constant care. Social workers had filed reports documenting severe disabilities and substandard living conditions. But these documents had vanished into bureaucratic filing systems, overlooked by administrators who found it easier to process monthly checks than to address the underlying causes. The financial implications alone were staggering. Over several decades, the Callaway family had consumed hundreds of thousands of dollars in disability payments, medical assistance, and emergency interventions. Yet, none of this expenditure had been directed toward addressing the fundamental issue, the continued practice of consanguineous marriage that guaranteed each new generation would be more severely compromised than their parents. County officials who had maintained the conspiracy of silence for generations suddenly found themselves under intense scrutiny. Why had they allowed the inbreeding to continue when the genetic consequences were so obvious? Why had no one intervened when the biological damage became undeniable? Why had the family been allowed to exist in conditions that would not be tolerated for livestock? The answers exposed a pattern of institutional negligence that stretched far beyond one isolated family. The Callaways were not just victims of their own genetic choices. They were casualties of a system that had decided their lives were not worth the complex effort required to help them. A cautionary tale. Today, the Callaway family still lives in their mountain hollow, but their world has been permanently transformed. The documentary exposure brought them resources they had never possessed, improved living conditions, regular medical care, and financial support from viewers across America. Yet, these improvements arrive wrapped in a cruel irony. The same publicity that helped them has also transformed them into a cautionary tale, a living museum of genetic catastrophe that serves as entertainment for millions of strangers. The fundamental questions their story raises refuse to dissolve into easy answers. How do we balance individual liberty with collective responsibility when genetics determine destiny? At what point does a family's constitutional right to privacy and reproductive freedom become secondary to the welfare of children who cannot choose their genetic inheritance? The Callaways exercised their American right to marry and reproduce according to their own values. Yet, the consequences of those decisions created suffering that spans 5 generations. Bioethicists continue to debate whether early intervention could have prevented the worst outcomes. If social services had acted decisively in the 1950s or 1960s, could the cycle of genetic destruction have been interrupted? Would mandatory genetic counseling, despite its uncomfortable historical associations, have been more humane than allowing the systematic biological deterioration to continue unchecked? These questions disturb everyone because they force us to confront the boundaries of human freedom when genetics are involved. The hidden price of individualism. The Callaway case also exposes the hidden price of American individualism taken to its logical extreme. In a society that prioritizes personal liberty above collective welfare, families like the Callaways can vanish from official view until their problems become too severe to ignore. The very same cultural values that protect us from government overreach also protected a family's right to destroy itself genetically, generation after generation, in full view of authorities who chose not to see. Perhaps most troubling is the likelihood that the Callaways are not unique. In isolated communities across Appalachia and beyond, other families may be conducting similar experiments in human genetics, hidden from a world that prefers not to acknowledge their existence. Mathematical certainty suggests there are other bloodlines trapped by the mathematics of consanguinity, other genetic laboratories operating in the shadows of American society. The story of Kentucky's Callaway family transcends genetics. It is about what happens when society abandons its most vulnerable members. It is about the cost of willful ignorance, the price of avoiding problems until they metastasize into tragedies, and the responsibility we all bear for the families we choose not to see. For generations of cousin marriages created Kentucky's most inbred family.